We are taking this long journey just through the biblical narrative. And we have made it. We started last year in the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures in what's called the book of Genesis. I just wanted to take some time to get us to know what's in the story of the Bible, because I always tell you should read the Bible, but I know many people never get through it from cover to cover. And while we encourage that, this is a way for us to at least see the major story arc. So we are doing this now for our second year, and we've made it to the era of the kings of Israel. And now the kings have, there was a few good kings, there was a few strong kings while the nation was together, but after Solomon died, the nation divided. And from the time the nation divided, it was never brought together again. And we took that event, and from that event forward, we began a series that we're calling Thrones. And Thrones is just our study of this era where the kingdom of Israel was divided, and the northern kingdoms kind of go in one direction, the southern kingdoms go in another direction. And we're talking about that in this era of our journey. Okay, so we've been up north for a while. We've been talking about the northern kings, and we got to meet 7 of them along the way. The last one was Ahab, whose death we saw last week. I got to tell you, today will not be as exciting as last week. Hard to beat last week's kill shot, but that was then and this is now. So, but this is an important part of the story because it's going to set, it's interesting, it's informative, it's important to know, and it's going to set the stage for some big things to come. So as we move through the story, we're going to head to the south today. We've not been in the southern kingdom for a little while. Last week, if you were with us last week, we did meet the king of the southern kingdom of Judah at this time that we're in. His name was Jehoshaphat, and we met him because he came up north and was with Ahab. But he was the son of King Asa. Asa was the king. We saw him several weeks ago already. And he was the king who was great. His whole reign, he was a great leader, a great ruler, a man of faith. But towards the end of his reign, he did one mess up. He made one mistake. And when a prophet of the Lord came to confront him about it, rather than taking that, he got very angry, got defensive, got prideful, and blew up and became a very bitter old man. Curmudgeon-y person, began very harsh to live with. His pride was hurt, and he actually turned his back on his faith at the end and never even sought God through anything, including his illnesses after that, because he was upset at being corrected. And we saw his story, but even though he ended poorly, he was a great king almost all the way through. When he died, his son Jehoshaphat took over, and Jehoshaphat is a great king. We met him last week up north when he was with Ahab, when Ahab went to battle and was killed, and afterwards he returned home. Now, we're going to look a little more closely at Jehoshaphat and his son, and then very briefly for a moment at his grandson today as we move the story forward down south. Let's pick up the story in 2 Chronicles 17 and verse 3. It says, "The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the example of his father's early years and did not worship the images of Baal." Two big things there. He didn't worship the images of Baal. That was the religion that Israel's been dealing with since they left Egypt in the wilderness years under Moses, all the way through now. It's always been all around. It was a very terrible religious practice with vile religious behaviors towards little ones and others. We don't have time to get into that again. But it was a messed up worldview. And the kings up north under Ahab and Jezebel, his family, they have now succumbed into that culture in Israel. But Jehoshaphat did not. And he followed his father's early years. Because remember, his dad was a great king until the end when he got turned sideways and upset about some confrontation. And so he was like his father for most of his reign. He was a good king. Now, it says in verse 4, he sought his father's God and obeyed his commands instead of following the evil practices of the kingdom of Israel. So the Lord established Jehoshaphat's control over the kingdom of Israel. All the people of Judah brought gifts to Jehoshaphat, so he became very wealthy and highly esteemed. In other words, he's a very popular ruler. He was a very popular king. We'll say more later. He was deeply committed to the ways of the Lord. He removed the pagan shrines and the Asherah poles from Judah. Now, why is he removing them? Because even though Judah is largely a nation that stayed on course with worshiping the God of all creation who led Israel out of slavery, even though that was the case, still, not everyone's going to follow suit, right? In what nation does everyone follow the national religion of choice? Anywhere, including today, right? Like you can go to a nation that's largely built upon, the idea of Christianity as its base, and you'll find all sorts of religions. You can go to Islamic countries and find Christians practicing. You can go to atheistic, communist-controlled countries and find all sorts of religion behind closed doors. And so that's always been the case. And up north in Ahab's day, though he was bringing these pagan practices up there were still people who worshiped the God of creation. And down south, though Jehoshaphat was a devout king, there were still people in the south who worshiped all sorts of crazy ideas. But the difference is it was not a democracy. Like, it wasn't like the United States of America that was built upon the idea of separation of church and state, or freedom of religion. Not freedom from religion, but freedom of religion, to do it, worship as you wish to worship, or not worship as you don't wish to worship. It wasn't like that. You could do a little bit more. So here's King Jehoshaphat saying, well, you know what? Up north, King Ahab's killing people who oppose his religion. Down south, Jehoshaphat's not going to kill anybody, but he's going to at least remove the shrines and the obscene poles that were the Asherah poles away from the land, so it wasn't so easy to access that, what he considered to be damaging behavior. And he was very devout in his faith to God. In verse 7, it says that in the 3rd year of his reign, Jehoshaphat sent his officials to teach in all the towns of Judah. Now, this is a very interesting thing he's doing. Jehoshaphat is actually going to take people on his royal payroll, paid from the taxes of the people, officials, and send them all over the country, all over Judah, to teach. What are they going to teach? Verse 9, they took copies of the book of the law of the Lord, and they traveled around through all the towns of Judah, teaching the people. That's fascinating. Most people, again, in these days, all the way through even the New Testament days, most people are illiterate, don't read. They're too busy trying to eke out a living. The majority of people, especially away from the cities. On top of that, there was no printing press, so everyone had to have a handy copy like you do of your 4 copies of the Bible. It wasn't that way back then. So whatever copies they had, these officials would travel to towns and would bring them and read them to the people. And this was all done under Jehoshaphat's authority, that he's going to commission and sanction and fund. He's a good king. He's going to fund the knowledge of their backstory, of God bringing them out of slavery and establishing them as a nation and giving them laws to live by. He's going to bring it to all the people everywhere, very intentionally. Now, in chapter 18, verse 1, it says, Jehoshaphat enjoyed great riches and high esteem, and he made an alliance with Ahab of the northern kingdom, Ahab of Israel, by having his son marry Ahab's daughter. Now, this is a spot we got to stop and park at for a few minutes to appreciate not just what's going to happen today, but what's going to happen in a few weeks here, okay? So Jehoshaphat was very intent on building an alliance with the north. And there's a lot of reasons that was a good idea. Some were practical to his own father's story, but some were practical to just in general. And that is that it was very common for kings to make alliances around them. You always want peace. You want to be at peace with those nations, especially the ones that border you, right? But the problem with the north, since the kingdom divided, is the northern kingdom was precariously close to the capital of the southern kingdom. Jerusalem was way north in Judah. So to appreciate what's happening here, remember that when Judah was its own kingdom for a little while under David's early reign, the capital was central in Hebron in central Judah. But David moved the capital up north to Jerusalem when he became the king, because at the time the nation was not divided. And so Jerusalem, being way up north in Judah, made it more central to the whole kingdom. The problem is when the kingdom divided, now Jerusalem is way up against the northern border, pretty close. And that means that they're closer to now a hostile group, the north. They're the one that broke off. And that was fine until Jehoshaphat's dad was king, and the king of the north at the time raided the border towns and took them over and posed a threat. And that's what caused his dad, Asa, to make a couple desperate moves that were not wise, that got him in trouble, that got him corrected, that caused him to flip his mind and get angry at the correction and go off the deep end towards the end of his reign. But it was all the pressure from the north. It'd be kind of like if we were, as the United States of America, might have enemies abroad, but if the enemies took over Canada and marched their forces down against our border towns and into our, we'd be getting kind of nervous, And so right there at the north, there was trouble. So Jehoshaphat, they had recovered all of that under his dad's reign, but Jehoshaphat says, I want peace up north. It's too close to home. And if I can have peace up north and alliance up north, then the other threats around us are easier to deal with if we have security to the north. So he understandably wants to build an alliance with Israel, with the northern kingdom. The problem is Ahab is in charge up there, and as we saw, Ahab and his wife Jezebel, they were just the worst. And God's trying to clean house up there to move past that era. But Jehoshaphat is just trying to do what's politically healthy for his own nation. But his thought was, I'll have my son marry Ahab's daughter. Now, his son's name is Jehoram. We're going to meet him in a few minutes here. Jehoram is a young man, probably like 17 roughly, I don't know. It's not said for sure, 16, 17 years of age. Young man. He has him marry Ahab's daughter. Her name is Athaliah. We'll meet her later. And these two get married in an alliance. Now, this is not abnormal. This is not abnormal in those days. Okay? We can go back to King David and King Solomon and remember how that, and not just there, but all over the world. Even in later centuries and millennia, right? Where kings would oftentimes build alliances with other nations by having marriage. Like a king would marry someone else, other king's daughter, or have his daughter marry another king, or their children, depending on their ages, their children would get married. And those marriages between kingdoms would bring alliances and peace between nations. Because all of a sudden you care about the other country because it affects your family, it affects your grandchildren. And so it brought strength to kingdoms to make alliances through marriage. And that's what Jehoshaphat tries to do with the north right here. The problem is it's Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. And we just saw it for the last several weeks. They were the worst. God has promised they're going to get wiped out completely. He's going to reset the whole thing up north. They were murderous. They were bullies. They were terrible people. And so it's not just a bad guy, a bad family. It's the worst. And it's the worst up in Israel that God established all those years ago that have turned their back on him to go this direction. So while this alliance is understandable politically, it was a terrible decision for Jehoshaphat's son to be married to Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. But an alliance is formed. And that set up the story last week. If you were with us last week, you saw what happened next. They're up north. They go to war. Ahab is killed in battle. Jehoshaphat, at the end of the war, returns with his forces back south to Jerusalem, back to Judah. And we pick up the story in chapter 19 and verse 1. When King Jehoshaphat of Judah arrived safely home in Jerusalem, Jehu, son of Hanani the seer, or the prophet, went out to meet him. Why should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? He asked the king. Because of what you have done, the Lord is very angry with you. Now again, he's upset not because of an alliance. It was normal for kings to build good diplomatic relationships with others around them. And David did the same thing centuries ago, a couple hundred years earlier. David did the same thing. He would have he would try to reach out to other kings and build friendships there. There are other situations like this. The beef here is that it was Ahab, and the prophet's like, these people hate the Lord. God's trying to deal with that mess and get them out of there, and you're sitting there making this alliance with your son and their daughter, and this whole thing. What are you doing? Trying to help them in battle? What are you doing? God's upset about that. It's not just any old bad king, it's the worst. And it's not just the worst anywhere, it's in Israel. But then the prophet adds this in verse 3, even so there is some good in you, for you have removed the Asherah poles throughout the land, and you've committed yourself to seeking God. In other words, you have not veered away. Jehoshaphat, you've not gotten sucked into this junk. I mean, they may be doing that up north, but you have not let it influence your personal faith journey. You have stayed devout in your faith. You're a good man, but you're making a bad alliance. Well, what does Jehoshaphat do with this confrontation? What does he do? Does he be like his father and get bitter and get angry and cut off his faith practices like his father did in his later years when he's corrected? Nope. Jehoshaphat actually takes it to heart. Now, he doesn't fully listen. He keeps trying to have these alliances with the north. But at the same time, he doesn't pull away from his own, he takes the input. He doubles down on his own personal faith commitment. In fact, he strengthens the faith of his whole nation from here. Look at chapter 19, verse 4. Jehoshaphat lived in Jerusalem, but he went out among the people, traveling from Beersheba to the hill country of Ephraim, encouraging the people to return to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. This is pretty cool. He's going to leave his capital city to travel. Kind of like you'd expect in a democracy, politicians do this. They'll travel all over the country. You know, in the old days, it was by train or whatever. Nowadays, they can fly in and out of cities to have rallies so that people can come and meet them and they can try and, hey, vote for me. Or maybe leaders to this day still travel to try to push agendas or policies they hope people will vote for. But this is not a democracy. Jehoshaphat doesn't have to do this. Not every king did this. But he makes it a point to leave the capital and travel all over the country with an agenda. And his agenda is to bring the people back to the Lord, to encourage them to strengthen their faith, to come back to their faith, or to get deeper in their faith. He's already sent these officials out earlier with the books of the law of the Lord to teach the people, but now he's showing up personally. Because let's be honest, when the king shows up personally, everyone gathers. That's the celebrity. They all gather for the show, and the king's able to say, hey, I'm here. Y'all need to trust in the Lord, follow him, put your faith in him. He is working the nation for a spiritual reason, and you got to appreciate that about Jehoshaphat. Not only that, look at verse 5. He appointed judges throughout the nation in all the fortified towns. And he said to them, always think carefully before pronouncing judgment. Remember that you do not judge to please people, but to please the Lord. He will be with you when you render the verdict in each case. Fear the Lord and judge with integrity, for the Lord our God does not tolerate perverted justice, partiality, or the taking of bribes. Now, that's a mouthful. What he has done, besides teaching the people the books of the law and traveling to encourage their faith, is he has established leadership. It says judges here, but the idea would be different than in a democracy. Obviously, everything poured down from the kingdom for laws, but local leaders would be people who would set policy on locally how to follow the laws nationally. They would deal with civil matters and policy matters, and with judicial matters between people with disputes with each other. And he says to his local leaders, you be honest people of integrity. You do not take your authority and abuse it. Do not be taking money under the table. Don't accept bribes. Don't be corrupt. Don't be personally enriching yourself. You be good leaders. Why is that important? Well, we know why it's important. Imagine if all the people of the land were being told by the king as leaders, hey, follow the Lord. Imagine if they were being told that. And then the leaders of them who were telling them that were dirty and crooked, taking bribes and being perverted. I mean, it would just undermine the whole message. So Jehoshaphat's like, it's important for us in leadership to lead with integrity. Wouldn't it be great if every ruler in the world today issued that edict to all their people they put in authority across their lands? Hey, let's be people of integrity. Let's be people of character. Let's do the right thing for the right reasons. You got to love Jehoshaphat. This guy's a rock star. In fact, it's hard to underestimate how big of a rock star he was. I'll just tell you this. I'll probably say this later, but I don't want to not say it. Jehoshaphat is, I would argue, the greatest king in Judah, in the whole land, since David. Maybe, or Solomon. Solomon was good for a while, then he was rough at the end. But he's definitely the best king that Judah's had since the kingdom's been divided. He's remarkable. All the things we just read about, if you were paying attention to that and not thinking about lunch, those are remarkable, remarkable leadership moments on his end. We're going to skip a couple stories for sake of time because we don't have time to go through every story. We've skipped so many stories in this journey. I'm just trying to take us through the major arc of the Bible. But you should read it for yourself. You really should. I hope you do. But anyhow, we're skipping a couple stories. Let me mention one is a battle comes. A whole nation is attacked by outside forces, and they pray and they fast for God's help in Judah. They go out to face them in battle. God promises them a victory. They're so excited. They bring their musicians in and their singers, and they sing praises to God. And as they sing praises to God, God fights for them, and they win a battle. It's the time the worship team won the big battle for the kingdom of Israel or something like that. I don't know. But anyhow, it's a whole story that is worth reading. We've done it before, but not today. Skipping down to chapter 20 and verse 35. It says, sometime later, King Jehoshaphat of Judah made an alliance with King Ahaziah of Israel, who was very wicked. We're talking about Ahaziah just briefly here, but I need to say this now so I don't forget to say it later. There's a lot of common names going to be used here. And it's going to get confusing, like which Ahaziah are we talking about? So in all eras, there are common names, right? Like names that you see that there's many people with the name John or Cindy or Arlen, or names that are very common like that. They're all over the place, right? Or maybe not. And so as we have common names, and as we deal with that, in eras, sometimes the names are generationally common. Like there's names now that you hear that, and you're like, that sounds like an older person's name. And then there's names that sound like a younger person's name because it's the craze right now. And sometimes within families, if there's namesakes, you have even more of that. So as you read the scriptures here, if you bother to pay attention and track along with what we're talking about here, and if you read this for yourself, you'll see some confusion because there is an Ahaziah who is the son of Ahab and Jezebel, king of Israel, and later there's going to be an Ahaziah who's the grandson of Jehoshaphat, his son's son, named after his uncle, because remember his son is married to this Ahaziah's sister, so that's the next boy's uncle, same name. And then there's over here in Ahab's side, there's a Jehoram, which is also Jehoshaphat's son's name. And if you don't understand that, you'll read these stories in the Bible, you'll be like, what's happening here? Because it just kind of goes that way. So sorting this out will help you track the story better. Anyhow, so Jehoshaphat makes an alliance with Ahaziah, who was very wicked. I want you to notice this because this is a big part of the narrative, is Ahaziah is no better than his daddy was. Ahab. Jezebel's still alive. She's influential. The whole family's a wreck. Terrible people. And he rules Israel. He's wicked. And Jehoshaphat's trying to build another alliance with him. Verse 36, together they built a fleet of trading ships at the port of Ezion-Geber. Then Eleazar, son of Dodavahu from Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat. He said, because you have allied yourself with King Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy your work. So the ships met with disaster and never put out to sea. This is the second time Jehoshaphat's made an alliance with the north. The second time he's been verbally reprimanded for doing so, but now he's also financially reprimanded for doing so. God destroys their business venture, just trying to get his attention, upping the consequences. Like, don't make alliances with people who are this messed up. God's trying to deal with them. Don't you get intertwined. But they are intertwined. Anyhow, there's another story we're going to skip today, but I need to mention it again, sake of time. Read these things for yourself if you would. It's the story of Jehoshaphat making a third bad alliance. It happens a third time. He gets together with a king of the north and another king from Edom to fight against a common enemy. They end up in the middle of a terrible situation. I don't have time to get into it. It's kind of hilarious. But they end up in a terrible situation. They look for prophetic help. They find Elisha, who is the assistant to Elijah at the time. Anyhow, they find Elisha, and he basically says, I don't even care to help you guys. You deserve what's coming to you. But Jehoshaphat was there, so Elisha says, because I have regard for Jehoshaphat, I'm going to help you. Otherwise, you guys are on your own. And they almost die, but they're delivered. And it's just a third time that Jehoshaphat makes an alliance. Third time he's rebuked for it. And this time it almost cost him his life. So the stakes are getting heavier. But he goes back home safely once again. We won't even get into all of that. In the end, Jehoshaphat dies. And he is remembered as a great king. Let me say it again. He's probably the best king they've had, the best king since the nations have been divided. He is honored as a great king. In chapter 21, verse 1, it says that when Jehoshaphat died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and his son Jehoram became the next king. As great of a leader as Jehoshaphat was, unfortunately, his son will not follow in his steps. He will not. In fact, his son was terrible. And it's a tragic thing, because the South has had great kings and meh kings, but they've not had any terrible ones. It's about to get bad. Let's read the story in verse 4. But when Jehoram had become solidly established as king of Judah, he killed all his brothers and some of the other leaders of Judah. Now, this is a big deal. We didn't read all this, but Jehoshaphat had done some intentional preparation before he died. He had sent his other kids. Let me just remind you that every king we've read about has multiple wives and a whole lot of offspring. That's just how it was. It wasn't supposed to be that way. God had warned Israel not to be that way from the beginning, but even David did that, okay? And so most of these kings had a bunch of children, a bunch of wives, a bunch of kids. And so Jehoshaphat had sent a bunch of his children all over Judah to lead in other places for two reasons. One is to perpetuate his influence across the nation, to encourage folks to come back to the Lord, to be people of faith, but also because he's scattering them so that there's no debate about who of his children would be the next king. Jehoram was the choice. So that when he died, Jehoram was prepared, been groomed for the job, and he steps into the throne. But when he becomes king, he decides to choose violence. He says, all my siblings are a threat. He has them all killed, and other leaders that his father had appointed to lead the nation well. Why? The South has never seen something like this happen since the kingdom was divided. I mean, the world's barbaric, but not there. Up north in the northern kingdom, it was crazy like that. They had a history of assassinations and hostile takeovers and butchering of royal families. But what's he doing? Killing off his brothers and killing off threats across the land. How he's bringing instability to Judah. Look at verse 5. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem for 8 years. Now, that's a short reign. You're going to see why in a moment here. But first, verse 6, but Jehoram followed the example of the kings of Israel and was as wicked as King Ahab. Check it out. For he had married one of Ahab's daughters. So Jehoram did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now, I'm not blaming her, although she's a terrible person, any more than blame Jezebel for Ahab's choices. These kings could have done the right thing. There are many kings. There are many kings throughout Israel, throughout history, including Israel's history, or other peoples, where the queen's not that powerful oftentimes. In fact, most of the time we read the stories of queens, they were kind of in fear in that kind of a world of their own life. I mean, they were glad to be queen, but they knew that if they made the king mad, bad things. Look at the story of Vashti and Esther. We'll get to those later. Kings had oftentimes opposed their wives. Look at David and Michal last year. We saw their story. So it's not like Ahab had to go down the path that he did, or Jehoram had to just because of their wives' influence. But man, their wives were influential in these cases. And they have many wives. But I don't know what it was about Jezebel, and I don't know what it is about Athaliah, her daughter. Them girls had some kind of a spell on those guys. I don't know what they had going on. But they were influential. In fact, we read this verse a couple weeks ago where it says that Ahab, there was no king worse in Israel than Ahab, who, under the influence of Jezebel, to quote the scripture, did terrible things. And we saw those stories. She led murders and hostile takeovers and just terrible practices. Under her influence, he was even worse. And now we have Jehoram down here, and his biography is that he's a terrible guy. He was wicked because he married one of Ahab's daughters. And again, maybe other wives, other kids, but this seems to be the influential one. And what a mess it brought to the south. It says, so Jehoram did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now, I'm going to pause right here to make a statement. I'm going to make two statements today, and they're both going to be kind of meddling, okay? They're both statements are going to be a little bit on the nose. And I know that, and I'm going to try and do that with the right type. But sometimes you got to say some stuff in the church as well as elsewhere as influencers. I need to say these things, so let me just jump on one of them right now. First thing I want to say is this: who you marry matters. Let me just say this: who you marry matters. It just does. And we saw the influence that Ahab had through his wife, and it's not her fault. He made his own choices, but it influenced him. Jehoram, he chose to be a terrible person, but he had influence. Who you marry matters. It's a big decision. It's not like Jehoshaphat had alliances that he shouldn't have had, but those alliances or friendships didn't change his faith journey. But when you become one with somebody, when you become 24/7 committed, it's so much more of an intimate relationship. It's going to have an effect, right? So it matters. And I know that as I say that, I'm going to say something about that to the young people who are still looking ahead to marriage. But let me just say something, because I know that in a room like this, someone's here last hour, this hour, or watching online later on or now. I know that for some of us, maybe you're like, ouch, Arlen, well, that's not my story, okay? I could have used that message a couple decades ago or something, Or, I wasn't paying attention back then, I didn't care. So I've got myself, I've been in a mess, and I've had a messy relationship that has come to an end, or maybe I'm still in one. And I know that happens. And let me just say this to all of us here. We all make bad choices in life. All of us do. I do. Let's not all air it all out, right? And we've all experienced the consequences of making bad choices in our parts of our lives, different kinds of parts of our lives. And hopefully, when we hear someone point that out as a path forward, we're like, yes, warn someone else to make a better choice. So my hope is that if you've been in a bad marriage before, still are, you made a careless choice a long time ago, or it just didn't work out well, whatever it may be. Hopefully, when I say that who you marry matters, you're my biggest supporters. You're not the ones who are ready to clap the loudest and say, amen. Tell the people who are making that choice in life how important this is. I'm counting on you to back me up here. Because whether or not you've experienced the good or bad side of this truth, it's true. And so if you're entering that phase of life, who you marry matters. Now, I know you can marry someone and they can pass all the right check marks, and they can later on change. That happens. And bring havoc to you. I know lots of people who get married somebody, they did everything the right way they thought, and then that person just was someone different later on. Or they fool you. That happens. And that's why I always say to young people when I talk about marriage, pray, 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 pray. Say, God, whatever I can't see that might be hidden from me, protect me. If you're a young person and if you're a young person looking to get married and prayer is not one of your major weapons of your dating arsenal, you need to add it. Pray, God, help me not make a mistake accidentally. Guide me to someone who will stand by me and stay with me, and add prayer. Because, things happen. But while you're doing that, don't ignore the red flags. If there are red flags, don't ignore them, because it matters. If there's warning signs, well, I'll just change them later. No, you won't. It doesn't work that way. And you go, it's going to be fine. It won't be a big deal. He's so handsome and she's so pretty, and they make me laugh, or they make me feel special. I got news for you. If it's a physical attraction, those things can change over time. If it's some kind of personality trait that you love, sometimes things that you're once drawn to become irritating later on. Don't elbow your husbands, ladies, or right now and say, or vice versa. But sometimes things shift. And there's something that's going to be deeper than that, something more true. Those things matter. I should date someone you're attracted to and find someone that makes you happy. Those are all important, but they don't trump character. They don't trump a person's personal. Is that person a person of faith? Are they wholesome? Are they a person of integrity? Are they a good person? Are they a faith-filled, faithful person? And again, God, in case they seem to be, but they're not, I'm praying that you'll protect me from a bad choice. And I'm not saying that's foolproof. I'm just saying don't run in and say, it doesn't matter, we're in love. They make me, there's chemistry. Chemistry projects sometimes turn into bad science nightmares all of the time, okay? Anyhow, so who you marry matters. I'm just going to leave it where it counts. So if you're young, I hope that you'll think carefully as you enter this important stage of your life. Ahab and Jehoram both were in bad relationships that were influential in their leadership, though they chose to do what they did. And that goes for you girls, goes for you guys. Be careful. I'm supposed to move along, but I can't, because someone's going to be like, I just got to get out of a bad situation. People have run out of one bad situation and just grabbed the first person to come along, like fleeing the frying pan and into the fire. Or, something like that. Or I don't want to be single and be alone. I have been doing this for over a quarter of a century, and I'm going to promise you this. And I know that it's hard to hear this, but I'm going to promise you this. There are worse things in life than being single. There are. Being married into a bad situation is way worse. I've sat across the table from both stories, and I'd rather deal with the single problems than I'm in a hellish marriage problems any day. Who you marry matters. Anyhow, I gotta move on. I'm meddling, and I know it's on the nose, and I'm looking forward, not backwards, but we'll talk about that later. 2 Chronicles 21. So just now, Jehoram just butchered off his brothers, killed a bunch of people, shook up the land of Judah. Him and Athaliah are a terror, just like Ahab and Jezebel are a terror up north. They're a terror down south. In verse 12, it says, Then Elijah the prophet wrote Jehoram this letter. This is what the Lord, the God of your ancestor David, says. You have not followed the good example of your father Jehoshaphat or of your grandfather King Asa of Judah. Instead, you have been as evil as the kings of Israel. You've led the people of Jerusalem and Judah to worship idols, just as King Ahab did in Israel, and you have even killed your own brothers, men who were better than you. So now the Lord is about to strike you, your people, your children, your wives, and all that is yours with a heavy blow. Verse 15, you yourself will suffer with a severe intestinal disease that will get worse each day until your bowels come out. I don't know what that means, but yikes. That is not the way you want to go. If you're picking paths of how it ends in life, that's not the one. Okay. Verse 16, then the Lord stirred up the Philistines and the Arabs who lived near the Ethiopians to attack Jehoram. They marched against Judah, broke down its defenses, and carried away everything of value in the royal palace, including the king's sons and his wives. Only his youngest son, Ahaziah, was spared. That's the name Ahaziah again, not Ahaziah, the king of the north, Ahab Jezebel's son, but Jehoram and Athaliah's son, same name, Ahaziah. He's spared. And of course, we'll have more wives and kids, but anyhow, right now, some are carried away. After this, verse 18, after all this, the Lord struck Jehoram with an incurable intestinal disease. The disease grew worse and worse, and at the end of 2 years, it caused his bowels to come out, and he died in agony. Oh, it's just a thing, man. I don't know what that was, but I don't want to catch it. His people did not build a great funeral fire to honor him as they had done for his ancestors. Now, that's important. In fact, we're going to see it again in a moment here. That's important right there. That the nation was relieved because they just watched the king come in and give 8 years of terror. 8 years of terrible reign has happened in the south. They've watched all the other royal kids that their beloved Jehoshaphat's other children get killed by this guy. They've watched all the other leaders that they looked up to get killed. They've been scared of him. And now he's gone. Check out verse 20. This is crazy. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 8 years. No one was sorry when he died. That's harsh, but that's how it was. Like no one was sorry when he died. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the royal cemetery. They're like, well, quick service. He ain't getting any deader, and they moved on. Because no one was sorry when he died. That's just how it was. That's the kind of person, that's the legacy he left behind. Anyhow, after Jehoram died, his son Ahaziah would become the next king. And it says in chapter 22, verse 2, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year. Say, why only 1 year? Because it's about to get real. But not next week. We're going to take a couple weeks off. We'll come back to this in a few weeks here. We're going to take a couple weeks to leave the royal kings of north and kings of the south. There's other things happening besides the kings' families, right? So we're going to take a couple weeks away from this part of the story. But when we come back to it in a few weeks, you're going to see why Ahaziah only reigns 1 year. But in the meantime, it says he reigned 1 year, and his mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of King Omri. Now, if that confuses you, remember, King Omri was the name of Ahab's father. Ahab's father was Omri. Ahab and Jezebel were the parents of Athaliah, and her paternal grandfather was King Omri, who built Samaria. And her father was Ahab, and her mother was Jezebel. So, though Jehoram is dead, this is Jehoram's wife, she is still alive, just like Jezebel is still alive up north. And Ahaziah, the young 22-year-old king, doesn't have a father or a grandfather who is great, who's gone, or a father who is gone. He's now a young king with a mother from Ahab's family. Verse 3 says, Ahaziah also followed the evil example of King Ahab's family, for his mother encouraged him in doing wrong. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as Ahab's family had done. They even became his advisors after the death of his father, and they led him to ruin. And again, we're going to take a couple weeks off from this topic, but when we come back to it, you're going to see how they led him to ruin. It's coming. But here's the thing. He didn't follow. For all his father worked so hard to build a legacy in the south, sending the law of the Lord all over the land, sending advisors all over the land, sending people to teach, making his own special appearances from town to town, saying, hey folks, come see the king, and then follow the Lord and put faith in him. For all that he did to appoint good leaders on the local levels, to secure the strength of his nation, his son and his grandson are not following that track. Instead, they're following the track of their family from the north. The other side of the family, Ahab's family, Jezebel's family. They're the advisors. They're the ones who have the king's ear in the south. And now we have a situation where Ahab and Jezebel, God's trying to sponge it out of the north, and now they have fully infiltrated the throne of the south. And that's a problem that we're going to address in a couple weeks or so. But I want to say something for today, and again, I told you there's a couple things I want to say today that are a little bit on the nose, and I know that, but again, I feel like that they need to be said from time to time. And so let me just say this one as well, and then I'll talk around it for a few minutes. While you save the world, don't forget your family. While you save the world, don't forget your family. Jehoshaphat was busy bringing all the people of the land, all the things he needed to hear. He worked extra hard to make sure he secured the borders, he built some strong alliances, he got everything ready, he taught the law, he put the right people in charge, he worked like no one else. The things we read earlier, he worked like nobody else had worked. But he was careless in this one area, just saying, hey, you know what, maybe my son can marry the daughter, it'll help us in this other front. And it was disastrous. And it's easy. We all want to make a difference. We all want to make a difference in our lives, don't we? Most of us, I want to start a company. I want to grow. I want to get promoted at my job. I want to be an influencer. I want to, away from work, make a difference in the things that are important to me, maybe in my faith community or whatever it may be. I get it. But while you save the world, don't forget your family. Now, I am not blaming Jehoshaphat at all for Jehoram's decisions. In fact, maybe make some statements about that before I make this practical. In the end, Jehoshaphat had a great legacy. Probably the best king since David, definitely the best king since the south and the kingdom was divided. Up to this point. Jehoshaphat had a great legacy, but Jehoram, his son, did not. Jehoram's choices were his own. They were his own. The only fault that we can really point to is Jehoshaphat having his son marry Ahab's daughter, which is a pretty significant one. But in the end, Jehoram didn't have to go down that path. He didn't have to turn from all the example his father set him and say, nah, I'm going to go with what her family wants, and I'm going to go this different direction. That was his decision. But boy, was he set up for failure. But here's the thing. He decided. And for you and me today, you are not responsible for your children's choices, your child's choices. You're responsible for your own. I'm responsible for my own. What I'm saying today is let's do our best, however, to do right in this area of helping them. One of our choices we make is to set them up best we can for success, and then they got to do with what they do with it. Do our best to do what's right in this area and leave the rest in God's hands. And so I just want to encourage you today, and I know that I'm talking to people, some of you are raising young kids right now. Some of you are just starting. We had a bunch of new babies. We had a baby section over here last hour. Like there was like 3 little babies, or 4, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4 little babies over here in the first hour, and we have some little ones in this room right now, and kids in the nursery, and kids next. Some of your kids are in the room next door, or they're teenagers, And then there's others who your kids are grown and gone. But the principle still applies. While you save the world, while you build whatever you're trying to build, or do whatever you're trying to do, don't forget your family. So let me just get real practical. They have to answer for what they do. So do you. So do I. But if you're raising young kids, here's my advice to you. Be present. And I get the whole cause. I understand cause. Okay, I'm a pastor. I got my whole life behind, a cause. I get that. But don't forget your family. It's so important that they're there to be influential, to have fun, to make memories, to guide, to not just show up when they're in trouble to be corrective, but to be around, to do things, to have that influence, to speak into their lives, to guide, to help, to grow, to lead by love and example. And I know sometimes the responsibility, it's easy for men and women we have careers to sometimes drown ourselves in something else that's everyone appreciates you at work, not always at home, or whatever the case may be, you might think. But don't neglect your family while you're doing whatever else is important to you. And maybe your kids are grown. Maybe they're all big now. And you're like, well, I don't always agree with my adult children's choices. Newsflash, nobody does. Same way that your parents don't always agree with your choices. But aren't you glad you have the freedom to make them, right? And when you look at your adult kids, you're like, you know what? They have the same autonomy like I wanted to have when I was an adult. And I don't have to agree with them. But you have a decision to make. Do you withdraw from them? Do you let the disappointments of what you prefer them to do when you can control things more cause you to have a rift, or do you just keep a relationship? And I was going to say this to you. It's easy. You don't shake the dust off your feet when it comes to your family. You shouldn't. And I know sometimes things get a little haywire. Sometimes you got to almost serve your way back into someone's life if they matter to you. Care, invest, take time. We move from stages. When our kids are little, there's the discipline years, and there's the training years. Discipline 0 to 5, training 5 to 12 roughly, coaching years 13 to 18, and then friendship years when they're adults. And I know that those are important stages to observe and honor. And when they're adults, you don't really have coaching anymore even, unless they let you. That's influence. And influence doesn't come by trying to control. It comes by loving and supporting and cheering someone on and praying when you don't like something and being positive the rest of the time and supporting them in their journey. But don't just walk away because you have better things to do. Don't forget. Don't neglect your family. Now this is not the cleanest application, but Jehoshaphat was a reminder. This story was a reminder to us, even though it's not exactly like our story today, in how the marriage went down. It was chosen for Jehoram. But it reminds us today whom you marry matters. It's not the cleanest example, but it's a reminder today that we can be busy saving the world and forgetting to take care of what's closest to home. Don't forget your family. I was reminded on the way out of the last service, some very strong emotions from some people who this hit really close to home, and they were grateful for the conversation because of things I can't talk about here. And it reminded me of how important it is we say this. How important it is we say, do the good things you're trying to do, but don't neglect your family. Because they'll make their own choices, and so will you. And you won't answer to God for their choices. But one of the choices I answer to God for is that I did my part to give them the best chance to succeed, to be present, to be helpful, to have the right approach, the right attitude, the right open-handedness as time goes on, and the right presence. That's what I'm accountable for. The rest is up to them. And the rest I leave in God's hands. The rest you leave in God's hands. But while you're doing all the good stuff you're doing, don't forget home. That's it for today. We're going to come back to the kings of Israel and Judah in a couple of weeks or so here, take a little detour for a bit into other parts of the story that are not including royal families. But for today, I hope all of us can think about all the good things that capture our attention, try to make money, build empires, whatever we're trying to do. We'll just be brought back to those people we call family and make sure we're doing our part. Let's pray.